Start. My name is John Gershman. I teach at the Wagner School, and just like to thank our co-sponsors for the talk today, which is the final talk in this semester's uh, uh, season, I guess, of the Conflict, Security, and Development series. Co-sponsors are Wagner's Office of International Programs, the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU Law School, the Master's Program in International Relations from the Graduate School of Arts and Science, the Center for Global Affairs at the School of Professional Studies, and the International Education Program at the Steinhardt School. Thank you all for your support. Our speaker today, Nerses Kopalyan, is an assistant professor in residence of political science at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. His fields of specialization include international relations, political theory, and the philosophy of science. He is the co-author of Sex, Power, and Politics and the author of World Political Systems After Polarity. And his current research concentrates on political violence and terrorism and its impact on geopolitical and great power relations. The talk today, and it's possible that we would think that the title is now partially outdated, is Armenia's Security Dilemma, the Russo-Azerbaijani Axis, and the Siege of Nagorno-Karabakh. Of course, events in the last couple of weeks have thrown what was the situation into a significant amount of turmoil that, excuse me, Professor Kopalyan is going to discuss. As is customary in our webinar formats, people should feel free to post questions in the Q&A function throughout, and I will throw those to Professor Kopalyan when his presentation is completed. So without further ado, Professor Kopalyan.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I do want to express my gratitude for New York University for organizing this. Indeed, the design of the talk had the specific title. The title still holds, but instead of talking about the siege of Nagorno-Karabakh, we're going to be discussing the collapse of Nagorno-Karabakh and the variables and determining factors that led to it. My talk is going to be designed to three general frameworks. The first is going to cover at the systemic and structural level in the region, which is going to be defined by Russia's diminishing power. Second component of the talk will address the developing nuances in the regional configuration, and that's going to basically be defined by what we are calling the Russo-Azerbaijani axis. And then the third part will address the collapse of Nagorno-Karabakh and how this came about. So in addressing the initial factors as far as the systemic variables that are shaping the region, needless to say, Russia has dominated the South Caucasus as an important part of its what they call the near abroad. So in this context, as part of this policy, Russia regards the post-Soviet space as being its own distinct realm. And within its own distinct realm, Russia has a tacit disregard or a certain elastic interpretation of the concept of sovereignty. Simply put, sovereignty matters until it does not. So it is the Kremlin's held belief that it has the right as an extension of its policies in its privileged sphere of influence to interfere into the domestic affairs of these countries. So, for example, whereas like in a Western canon, we generally separate domestic politics from regional politics, in the post-Soviet space, there is no such separation. Everything is geopolitical. So by blurring the lines between domestic politics and geopolitics, Russia gives itself what I call hegemonic agency. Thus, contextually, the strong Russian state, which is a domestic phenomenon, is directly tied to geopolitical success, which is an international phenomenon. For the Russian state, the two cannot be separated. In this context, Russia does not take the sovereignty of the countries in the post-Soviet space seriously. And we're going to see how at the systemic and structural level, this has affected developments in the South Caucasus. And so when there are any attempts by any post-Soviet space countries to leave Russia's authoritarian orbit, the Kremlin qualifies this to be an attack against Russia's own strategic interests. So when we talk about, for example, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, which was a democratic breakthrough in 2004, the Orange Revolution or Euromaidan in Ukraine, we saw happen basically in 2014, culminating in 2014 with Euromaidan, or the Velvet Revolution in Armenia that happened in 2018. The Kremlin qualified all of these not simply domestic democratic breakthroughs that express the will of the people of the given countries, but rather they qualified these as sort of being geopolitically led movements that harmed Russian interests. So the notion of a color revolution, quote unquote, for Russia has a fundamental geopolitical configuration to it. These are not democratic movements from the lens of Russia. These are geopolitical pivots designed to fracture Russia's spheres of influence. So, in that context, we have seen each of these countries that have undertaken some form of a democratic breakthrough, they have all faced some level of fracture or Russian attack, either directly or through Russian proxies. So, Georgia suffered it in 2008. Ukraine, as we've seen, has suffered it from the invasions of Crimea, Donbass, and then the recent war in 2002. And Armenia has continuously suffered it at the hands of Azerbaijan, which has been serving as a Russian proxy within this specific domain. And I will talk about the proxyization of Azerbaijan in a bit. So it is within this broader paradigmatic framework that we attempt to understand the recent developments in the South Caucasus, especially when we talk about Russia's regional decline and its diminishing relevance as a hegemon. And what have been the consequences of this on Armenia's security dilemma and the very recent collapse of Nagorno-Karabakh that we saw last week. So collectively, these developments, specifically with the exogenous effect of the Ukraine war on the internal developments of the South Caucasus, have produced five major outcomes. First has been, as I noted, the diminishing of Russian influence and power in the South Caucasus. Second has been the disintegration of the region's Russian-led security architecture. Third has been Armenia's pivot to the West. Fourth has been the role of the United States and the European Union filling this power vacuum that has been left by Russia. And fifth, as a response to these developments, we have seen the formation of what I call the Russo-Azerbaijani axis and how this led to the collapse of Nagorno-Karabakh. So let's sort of, qualify the methodical diminishing of Russian power influence in the South Caucasus so we could better understand developments. A large body of scholarship demonstrates that dispersion of regional power by virtue of hegemonic decline is conducive to regional instability. And so the collapse of the Russian-led security architecture in the South Caucasus is a byproduct of this dispersion of power. And the results have been pretty straightforward. We have seen Azerbaijan acting a lot more aggressively and further enhancing its security ties with Turkey. We have seen Armenia decoupling from Russia and pivoting towards the West. And we have seen Russia's inability to neither satisfy its treaty obligation towards Armenia or even be able to stabilize the region. In this context, there has been a robust decline in Russian soft power in the region and a complete fracturing of the South Caucasus as Russia's southern security flank. So, understanding sort of these developments, what is more important here to grasp is that because for 30 years, Armenia's security architecture was reliant on Russia's security guarantees, the collapse of the Russian-led security architecture basically shifted the entirety of the security configurations in the South Caucasus, and this produced larger systemic and structural outcomes. In this context, what we saw is that as Russia's hegemonic status declined, the United States and the Europeans increased their involvement to fill this power vacuum. And these produced multitude of results that are quite new in the region that we have not seen in the past. But Russia has become a secondary actor when it comes to conflict management. And the United States and the Europeans have taken the lead in basically providing the platform and the mechanisms of mitigation for a regional conflict. So conceptually, while Ukraine, as I noted, is the exogenous factor that have produced these systemic repercussions for the South Caucasus, it is the splintering of Russia's security policy for the region that led to these developments. And the best way to understand these Russia's policy and its collapse is to cover a concept known as pivotal deterrence. And I'm going to quickly share a slide here. Oh, there we go. So important to observe here is that Russia's policy from 1994, which is when the first Nagorno-Karabakh war between Armenia and Azerbaijan ended under a ceasefire that was secured by Russia. So from 1994 to 2020, Russia's policy was defined by a concept known as pivotal deterrence. And this precept basically holds that a regional power does not take sides between two conflicting states, but rather has an interest in deterring war. Thus, the regional power pivots between the warring states to deter one actor from initiating hostilities against the other actor. So Russia's pivotal deterrence was defined by its power to affect potential military outcomes, thus leading both states to fear that Russia might pivot against them, and therefore it would deter the states from acting. So as a strategic act of deterrence, right, what this pivoting policy did is it exerted external, quite a bit of leverage against both actors, and it enhanced Russia's leverage and influence in the region. So the ambiguity and uncertainty that came with Russia's posture of neutrality and the unpredictability of which way Russia may pivot was designed to basically warn both sides that Armenia or Azerbaijan, if you misbehave, I will basically, as the regional hegemon, act against you. And so this pivoting structure allowed Russia to dominate regional power configurations until 2020. However, Azerbaijan's initiation of the 2020 war fundamentally ruptured and eroded this pivotal deterrence policy that Russia had. More so, setbacks in Ukraine completely led to the disintegration of this policy. So as we see here, fundamentally, the initial structuration of the policy pretty much had become irrelevant. As you see in the slide, the important factors that shaped the policy were pretty much diminished. And so we went from a robust capacity to deter and threaten and leverage both actors in the region to one where which Russia had lost extensive influence and leverage. In this context, unable to deter Azerbaijan and unwilling to fully pivot towards Armenia, the collapse of Russia's pivotal deterrence policy led to the collapse also of Armenia's Russian-led and Russia-dependent security architecture. And so in this context, as we see, right, Russia basically lacked an ability to arm either side. It lacked the ability to meet its alliance obligations, and it also lacked the ability to control and mediate the conflict. And this pretty much explained the disintegration of the security architecture of the South Caucasus. And so the byproduct of this collapse was Azerbaijan's increased military expenditure independent of Russia, which had been going on for a long time, but then that became finalized, and Russia's inability to fulfill its capacity to arm Armenia. So what happened was the development of a very robust asymmetry in the region, where Azerbaijan was able to continuously arm itself, while Armenia was unable to ascertain arms by virtue of Russia's inability or strategic negligence with respect to meeting its responsibilities to Armenia. And so collectively, what we saw were two developments. Baku fundamentally developed a relationship with Russia on its own terms, thus becoming a stronger regional actor in the South Caucasus, while Armenia sought alternative alliance options. And this is just another way of saying Armenia had to pivot west because Russia was no longer a reliable or a trustworthy regional security guarantor. And so these developments, of course, as I noted, brought about the enhanced role of the United States and the European Union into the South Caucasus. And the United States had been absent from the South Caucasus for a very, very long time because this was viewed to be Russia's backyard. And so we need to imagine the extent to which Russian power has exponentially diminished that has allowed the US and the West to kind of step in and fill that power vacuum. And so the United States has attempted, although not always successfully, to curtail Azerbaijan's aggressive behavior. U.S. objective has been, to some extent, to enhance Armenia's security and the survival of its democracy. As we're going to see, that did not apply to Nagorno-Karabakh, but the United States is attempting to apply that to the sovereignty of the Republic of Armenia. In this context, also, the United States has been attempting to basically help dislodge Armenia from Russia's authoritarian orbit and thus secure Russia's what we're calling soft exit from the region. Not that Russia would completely leave the region, but soft exit in the sense that it would be the dominant actor in the region. And so the US is seeking to carve out, based on the collapse that we see in the screen here, a certain democratic sphere of influence in the region, and more specifically, to perhaps establish a democratic dyad of Georgia and Armenia to further amplify US and by extension, European interests in the region. Needless to say, prior to the Ukraine war, this would have been impossible. And this is why the Ukraine war, as an exogenous factor that diminished collective Russian power, is crucial in us being able to understand the developments in the South Caucasus. So what we're seeing is the West's newfound support for Armenia's security dilemma has punctured Russia's South Caucasus security policy, and this methodical diminishing has altered the regional configurations. Now, aligned with this assessment is also important to understand what exactly was Armenia's security policy. So we knew what Russia's architecture was and how the region's security was structured. Armenia also had a policy of its own, and this was known as extended deterrence. And extended deterrence basically is a modality of deterrence that is designed to dissuade and discourage attacks by relying on a third party, such as an ally or a partner. So in this case, it's very, very straightforward, right? Armenia was the deterring state, and to deter Azerbaijan, that was the antagonistic actor, Armenia extended its deterrence. It relied on a third party, on Russia, to secure its interests and its physical security. So the logic of extended deterrence fundamentally relies on the conceptual understanding that should the antagonistic actor attack the deterring state, right, the third party would intervene and stop it. And so it's a question of perceptivity. As long as the antagonistic actor is convinced that the third party will become involved, it would not engage in aggression. But if the antagonistic actor has become convinced that the third party will not interfere, then the entire deterrence model collapses. And in this context, this is precisely what happened in the 2020 war. Armenia's reliance on Russia by virtue of extended deterrence proved to be a bubble. It became quite clear that Russia was never going to fulfill its treaty obligations, and therefore Armenia for 30 years had an inherently flawed security architecture and a deterrence model. I'm going to see, get out of the. All right. So conceptually, what we saw in due time was the consequences, one would say, of this very complicated decline in the extended deterrence and security modeling of Armenia. And so fundamentally, the outcome, of course, was Armenia's pivot to the West and Armenia's decoupling from Russia. And this is very important because Armenia, from 1994 until 2020, for all means and purposes, from Kremlin's perspective, was a Russian satellite. And so for a powerful country like Russia to lose its satellite, and more so to lose it to the West, was extraordinarily complicated and complex process that created more instability in the region. And so for Russia to be able to mitigate these developments, it basically determined to align itself with Azerbaijan in the South Caucasus to obstruct Armenia's western pivot. Russia's rationale was very straightforward. If it cannot control Yerevan, which is Armenia's capital, officially Yerevan, if it cannot continue having leverage over Armenia, then it viewed Armenia being no different than Georgia after the Rose Revolution, where they pivoted towards west, or precisely what happened in Ukraine, where Ukraine robustly pivoted west. So Russia's posturing was that if I cannot control Armenia, if I'm going to lose Armenia from my authoritarian orbit, right, I will lose the South Caucasus. In this context, it developed a access with Azerbaijan, where Azerbaijan will serve as a proxy in the region to both deteriorate Armenia's security capacities and thus obstruct Armenia's ability to pivot west. And so, viewed through that lens, we see that Russia and Azerbaijan have been working quite consistently with each other to not only obstruct Armenia's western pivot, but more specifically to also keep the West out of the South Caucasus. And so, in their both of their policies in the region are defined by a very important alignment to not allow the regional conflict of becoming internationalized, but rather to keep it localized within a domain of Russian and Azerbaijani control. In this context, a few things are quite clear. And when we talk about both Moscow and Baku attempting to maintain the authoritarian orbit in the region, a democratic Armenia, under the diplomatic protection of the West, for example, alters the regional balance of power, and this is fundamentally problematic for Baku. At the same time, a democratic Armenia, under the protection of the West, automatically removes Armenia from Russia's orbit and influence, thus perpetuating what Kremlin fears is a fracture and a Western infringement into its sphere of influence. So contextually, we need to understand the Russo-Azerbaijani axis within this configuration. Now, what are the characteristics of the Russo-Azerbaijani axis? Well, we've seen, for example, that Russia has provided extensive diplomatic capital to Azerbaijan in the last year. This has become very, very clear in the UN Security Council meetings, in the Kremlin's talking points, and its continuous support for Azerbaijan. In essence, every modality of aggression that Azerbaijan has engaged in, the entire West has condemned this behavior and attempted to mitigate it, with the exception of Russia, who has refused to criticize or take steps to curtail Azerbaijan's behavior. And note that Russia is supposed to be an Armenian ally who is actually supporting Armenia's antagonistic state to attack Armenia. So these configurations have completely disrupted the stability in the region. Furthermore, as I've noted, both have attempted to make the regional developments localized, and they have worked together to deny international instruments or the involvement of the West. We've seen, for example, both Russia and Azerbaijan rejecting the rulings of the International Court of Justice. We've seen the Russo-Azerbaijani axis opposing a UN fact-finding mission or the presence of international instrument. Both have, for example, rejected international humanitarian efforts or international peacekeepers. And both have come out very aggressive in criticizing the presence of the European Union observer mission that was placed on the border of Armenia and Azerbaijan. So there's been a synchronized modality of behavior, collaboration between the two. In this context, it is in both countries' strategic interest to basically deter and obstruct Armenia's western pivot. Azerbaijan is basically engaging in this to maintain the regional imbalance of power, and Russia is doing this, as I noted, to obstruct any fractures in its sphere of influence. And so the attempt to maintain a regional authoritarian orbit and to punish or stop Armenia from its western pivot, which would enhance America's and the European Union's presence in the South Caucasus, more robustly explain the Russo-Azerbaijani axis. In this context, the objective of this axis then has been twofold. One, Azerbaijan obviously has demands, and that has been the absorption of Nagorno-Karabakh. Second, Russia would mitigate this demand if Russia's objectives are met, which is the collapse of Nagorno-Karabakh, leading to domestic instability in Armenia, and therefore leading to regime change or a coup that is triggered by pro-Russia actors, which would, of course, result in the overthrow of the Velvet government or Armenia's democratic government, and thus result of a puppet regime, a pro-Russia regime that would again return Armenia to Russia's authoritarian orbit. So in that context, when we observe these developments, how the collapse of Nagorno-Karabakh came through, those are the underlying explanatory factors. More so, there's another important factor that explains this, and it is Russia's broader grand strategy that comes not simply to the South Caucasus, but its entire security architecture for all of Eurasia and pretty much its global posturing. When we observe Russia's grand security strategy, even from the 90s, Russia has always considered the South Caucasus to be its southern security flank. And its southern security flank fundamentally is defined by Russia's control and dominance of Armenia. Simply put, it is anchored on Russian dominance of Armenia. And so, should Armenia, for example, be no longer part of this configuration, the Russian security architecture, its southern security architecture, collapses. This is why, for Russia, maintaining dominance or bringing back Armenia as a satellite under its control remains its number one fundamental policy. So the variables that are explaining in this context the Russo-Azerbaijani collaboration in the collapse of Nagorno-Karabakh, right? In Azerbaijan's continuous attacks against Armenia proper, Russia's refusal to meet its treaty obligations towards Armenia, Russia's refusal to recognize that what Azerbaijan is doing is an act of aggression, and of course, Russia's basically collusion with the September 19 attack against the population of Nagorno-Karabakh all demonstrate or empirical evidence that explain the underlying objectives and the modality of behavior that was designed by Moscow and Baku. It is within this context that I speak of the proxyization of Azerbaijan. This doesn't mean that Azerbaijan is a satellite of Russia. What this means is Russia uses Azerbaijan as a proxy when it comes to Azerbaijan being an instrument of brute force against Armenia. So it is utilized in a specific context. So Baku doesn't listen to Russia when it comes to other interests that it has or other alliances that it has, but rather it serves as an instrument, as a proxy for Russian regional power because Russia's power has diminished to maintain the authoritarian orbit, to derail Armenia's western pivot, and to collapse democratic Armenia. Within this configuration, Russia had very little reservations in allowing the collapse of Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan's absorption of Nagorno-Karabakh, because from Russia's lens, the collapse of Nagorno-Karabakh was supposed to trigger instability and the fall of the democratic regime in Armenia, which would allowed Russia to reabsorb Armenia and install it as a satellite. So the interconnection here and the causal relationship remains quite robust. More so, there's quite a bit of evidence that supports these developments. For example, 3 weeks before Azerbaijan's assault on Nagorno-Karabakh, Medusa, which is basically a group of Western, international, and Russian investigative journalists, were able to reveal that the Kremlin had already began its hybrid warfare policies by instructing Russian media and Kremlin mouthpieces to begin attacking Armenia and official Yerevan for the pending invasion, developing a narrative that says what is about to happen is Armenia's fault because Armenia pivoted west. Therefore, the pending collapse of Nagorno-Karabakh is Yerevan's fault. In this context, Russia's objective was to provide cover for Azerbaijan in the assault that it was about to take place, and the blame was basically to be structured against Armenia. Russia's objective, of course, was very, very straightforward here, right? To both give some justification for Azerbaijan's behavior, but more so to trigger domestic fallout in Armenia, where the Armenian public would rise up in blaming the government for what had developed in Nagorno-Karabakh, and therefore the 120,000 max exodus, the ethnic cleansing that took place in Nagorno-Karabakh, to be somehow the fault of the Armenian government as opposed to the Russo-Azerbaijani axis. This was the prevailing information warfare that Russia instigated before the attack. Now, of course, that did not work, or at least until now it hasn't worked, but those factors are very, very important indicators. Furthermore, there's sufficient evidence that basically demonstrates how Russia had prior knowledge to the pending attack. So the collusion and collaboration was very, very straightforward. So contextually, when we observe Russian declining power, when we observed the systemic and structural variables, when we observed Armenia's pivot and the formation of the Russo-Azerbaijani axis, and when we observed the Proxization of Azerbaijan as an instrument that Russia would use to basically obstruct and deteriorate, eradicate Armenia's democracy, and the collapse of Nagorno-Karabakh was an important mechanism of that process, we develop a much better understanding. Overarchingly, a strong Russia would not have allowed this to happen. And this is why its diminishing power in Ukraine is such an important explanatory factor in allowing us to understand how Azerbaijan was able to get away with mass ethnic cleansing, how Russia has collaborated for this to happen, and what the fallout and the consequences are going to be for the region after this.